So let's get started. So I won't do the whole introduction about why you're speaking to us for the meeting we had, but I see lots of opportunities for Optima to get involved with CEBRA, and you stepped forward as someone who had some really interesting problems that we would like to hear about. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about these two projects, government contracts that I think you've had, Value and then Value Added. Great name, love the name of the projects. And yeah, let's hand over to you and learn more about it. Thanks, Aaron.
Perfect. Can you just nod your head, Kate, if you can hear me okay?
Yes.
And see that, and you can see the slide pack. Fabulous. Yep. Right, we'll get started. Let me just start my timer so I've got a sense for where I'm at. So the two projects that I'm going to talk about today are Value and Value Added. These are two projects that we've done on behalf of the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. And the emphasis of those two projects have looked at both the value that is generated by Australia's border biosecurity controls and the steps that they could put in place in order to maximise that impact of those investments that they make at the border and offshore. And that, as I was just touching on, for those of you that are just joining us at the beginning of the session, that really is a project that commenced, or at least the idea for it commenced back in 2015. It's been a long and sustained commitment that we've had with the Commonwealth over that period. The people that have been involved in the research shown there, so Natalie Stokell, who's the Associate Dean for Research at the University of Tasmania in their Economics faculty, John Baumgartner, who's a postdoc and programmer based within CEBRA, and Tom Compass, who is another chief investigator of the Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis, all of whom are based in the School of Biosciences here at the university. The best place to start this conversation is that conversation in 2015 that was the genesis for this project. So what that conversation was a fairly routine exchange, really, between the then Secretary of the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources and Senator for New South Wales, Senator Williams. And at the time, there'd been a recent run of incursions or outbreaks in Australia of introduced pests and diseases. And Senator Williams put it to the Secretary that he was unsure about whether or not the department was acquitting its obligations adequately. And basically said, well, in light of all of these recent and increasing incursions, how confident are you that the department is doing a good job? And the Secretary at the time replied that, as you're well aware, that the biosecurity system operates an appropriate level of protection, and then that appropriate level of protection is very low, but not zero. And because it's not zero, we expect that outbreaks will occur. And so the Senator retorted back and said, well, if you don't expect that the number of outbreaks is going to be zero, what is an appropriate number of outbreaks? And of course, the problem with that is that biosecurity operates a risk-based regulatory model where they aim to reduce risk. And what they mean by that is essentially the aggregate damages done by the organisms that do ultimately make their way through the border. And the reason why that's important is because what they're actually trying to do is reduce the likelihood of low likelihood, high consequence events, and potentially at the same time do that by allowing through events that are perhaps more frequent but much lower consequence. So the number of outbreaks is actually a very poor indicator of the overall performance of the system. And in following that logical step forward, in conclusion, people would say, well, then if we're obviously trying to prevent these significant agricultural impacts, for every year that we prevent a foot and mouth disease outbreak happening in Australia, we're saving ourselves $52 billion. And there are a really wide range of consequence estimates that exist on the kinds of harms that would come to Australia should these pest or diseases ultimately establish. The foot and mouth disease one, for those of you that are not familiar with biosecurity, is the most well studied and well understood. Foot and mouth disease has in the last week been detected in Indonesia, the island of Indonesia next to Bali, which is causing quite a bit of concern. And based on that, people would say, well, look, the fact that the foot and mouth disease hasn't arrived in Australia indicates this biosecurity system is valuable. And so on first principles, people would say, well, look, biosecurity is valuable just on the basis of the fact that none of these high consequence events, the absence of them from having occurred. And the outcome of this project, cutting right to the chase, is that we've concluded that it is. So based on the simulation modelling that we've done, we've concluded that over the next 50 years, the effect of the biosecurity system is to reduce damages from somewhere in the order of $672 billion back to something more like $350 billion before we then apply the Commonwealth, the controls that are deployed by the states and territories, which reduces that much closer down to zero. That comes at a cost of about $10.5 billion per year in terms of the investment made by the Commonwealth biosecurity agencies. And when we net those out from each other, there's a total net present value of the order of $314 billion, and an average return on investment of 30 to 1. What's really significant about those results is, if we have a look up in the top right-hand corner here, we can see that agriculture is a primary beneficiary of those, but we can also see that there's several other sectors that are perhaps not described or mentioned as frequently in the same breath as agriculture when we talk about why biosecurity is such an important thing. And so in that, I'm talking about domestic animals, I'm talking about recreation and tourism, recreation being domestic recreation within Australia by Australians, tourism being international tourism, people coming in from overseas, but also a range of different ecosystem services such as carbon and sequestration, erosion control, flood mitigation, and so on. So essentially the way that we've done this, and we'll step through these processes in a minute, is we said, well, what do we expect the damages to be in the red here if the biosecurity system was turned off? And we compare that to what we expect the damages to be in the event that the biosecurity operates in the way that it does now, so the status quo. And we compare and simulate the estimate, or simulate and then compare the damages that arise from 40 separate biological hazards over a 50-year period, and iterate that 50,000 times for each of those states. So on and off being a different state. And the reason why that's really important is that when we look at those estimates that we had up on the screen previously, what they described was actually the residual loss. So what they're saying is, if you were to imagine that nothing happened, what would the damages be in the event that a biosecurity outbreak occurred? And the problem with that thinking is that that doesn't describe the reduction in what those impacts are given the presence of the system, and those are the damages that we avoid. So essentially what we've done through those processes, and what we're illustrating in those charts that I showed a moment ago, is we're saying, well, what would the damages be if the system was turned off altogether? And how do they compare to the damages that we observe despite the fact that the biosecurity system is in operation? And the remarkable thing about this is that nobody has analysed this question in the biosecurity context in Australia previously. So we have a ton of estimates around what would be the residual loss, and we use those to guide our risk-based resource allocation decisions. But in fact, no one has tackled this question of avoided loss. And the reason why we do that, and this as a group of people involved in optimization and mathematics and statistics, none of this will be new to you. But we're operating in a risk-based system. So we're actually not preventing a foot and mouth disease outbreak every year. We're operating in the context where we previously might have expected a foot and mouth disease outbreak to have occurred perhaps once every 5 years, so with an annualized likelihood of 0.2, and at some consequence of, say, 20 million. So we can determine an expected value from that to work out what the damages might be in the long run under that particular scenario, and then compare them to what we expect to occur given the presence of the biosecurity system, and again, subtract those from each other to get an expected benefit. And certainly in the actuarial sciences, if we were to think about this, this is the approach that they would take. They would say, okay, well, we have a range of different hazards. If in the natural hazard space, they would talk about fire and flood and storm, and they would work out what the likelihoods and consequences of each of those events were. They'd refer to them as vulnerabilities and exposures, And they would progressively sum them up, calculate an overall expected value, and charge some risk premium on top of those in order to calculate an insurance premium. And they would compare those and come up with some measure of avoided loss. And certainly when this project was first commenced, that was the intention on the way that we would proceed, given that we had all of these pre-existing consequence estimates for those outbreaks or for those pests and diseases that I outlined earlier. The problem is, in the biosecurity context, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work for a couple of really important reasons, but mostly because the assumptions that underpin the use of these methods in the actuarial sciences don't hold when we apply them to biosecurity problems. The first and most problematic is pest persistence. So if we were to take the example above this column here, example A, what we can see is the typical actuarial case. So where there is an event occurs, that event results in a loss. And if we were to conceive this perhaps as a house burning down, the insurance company would make a payout. The asset would then be restored back to its original value. And when a subsequent event occurred that affected that same asset, the damage done by that second outbreak would be independent of the damage done the first time around, because the value of the asset had been restored as a result of the loss or the payout that was made by the insurance company. In the biosecurity example, particularly in the counterfactual, particularly in the system off example, if we are to assume that no action is taken, as the first outbreak arrives and spreads throughout space over time, when we then have the second outbreak, the damages done by the second outbreak are dependent on the fact that the first outbreak is present in the environment. And the problem that that leads us to is that if we were to multiply our likelihoods by our consequences and generating an expected value, we would not have damages, or the expected value would not equal the risk or the harm that is actually observed in the environment. And usually when I talk about this in a biosecurity audience, they would say, well, look, but these events are very rare, and Australia is a very big place, so the likelihood that two incursions of the same organism would arrive at the same location is actually pretty low. The problem with that is that actually the likelihood of two outbreaks arriving at the same location is actually much higher than we realise. The example that we've got over here on the right-hand side is some research of mine that was back in 2006, showing the locations of first records of each of the 2,700 exotic plant species that have been observed in Australia. And what you can see is that they're highly clustered, and there are statistically significant clusters within this diagram over here on the right. And unsurprisingly, we fitted a Poisson point process model to this actually. And what we were able to determine was that there's a really significant correlation with human population and also land use associated with the intensive land uses that are most likely to introduce pests and diseases, and that those overcome any selection and sampling bias across space. And that as a result, and we have observed this also most recently in relation to tramp ants, that we do actually see multiple occurrences of the same locations, particularly around ports, for instance. So this idea that independent outbreaks will exist within the environment is actually really quite false. Thirdly, when we stop and think for a moment about the fact that we're not just modelling individual pests and diseases. So even in the previous example, we've talked about, well, will an outbreak of the first the first outbreak of the same organism interact with the second outbreak of the same organism? The additional problem that occurs is where we have outbreaks of an individual pest or disease that influence the same asset. So Ceteris paribus is a Latin phrase that's used, or was typically used a lot by economists in the 80s and 90s in particular. And the idea that they're presenting there is that all things should remain equal. And that means that when we do an analysis of the impacts of foot and mouth disease, we do so assuming that African swine fever, classical swine fever, and Nipah virus also aren't present in the environment. All other things remain equal. We just model the impacts of foot and mouth disease. The challenge that presents is that foot and mouth disease is a disease of ungulates, so it affects sheep, goat, pigs, and beef cattle, or beef and dairy cattle, as do African swine fever, as does classical swine fever, as does Nipah. These are all diseases of swine. So all 4 of these diseases affect pigs. And what that means is that if we were to assume that foot and mouth disease was to reduce the productivity of pork by 50%, and then African swine fever was to reduce it by a further 50%, and then classical swine fever was to reduce it by 50%, and Nipah was to reduce it by 50%. If we were to add the impacts of these diseases up, we would end up with 200% of the value of the industry being destroyed, which of course can't occur. You can't kill the same pig twice. The same thing applies when we think about fruit fly or these grass examples over here. The primary impact in terms of these fruit flies is cold storage requirements. Each of these might have a cold storage requirement in the order of 30 days or 32 days or 34 days or 36 days. You don't have to add up every additional cold storage requirement for every additional species. You only need to take the maximum in terms of minimizing the impacts or offsetting the impacts of those organisms when they're present in your particular host crop or commodity. And so what that means is that by taking that expected value approach and then summing up the harm, the expected value across all of the individual hazards, we would again be essentially committing that same logical error. The fourth is about natural variability. So there's been a lot of emphasis in the biosecurity system on this number over here, which is the $52 billion estimate of the impact of foot and mouth disease should it establish in Australia. Putting aside whether or not that analysis is correct or not, that was a deliberately constructed worst case. And the biosecurity system protects us not just from the worst case, it also protects us from the best case. Which might be this number over here, which is a far smaller outbreak that's localized in a small area that might not be well connected to the rest of Australia's production system. So, it might be, Buffalo near Darwin or something, where, the disease comes in, it's detected relatively soon, and because the number of susceptible hosts in the immediate proximity of the first affected animals or the index case is small, the diseases are able to be stamped out relatively quickly before it's able to spread widely, and that the damages as a result that occur are far smaller. And essentially, as government investors, we need to be risk neutral. So we actually need to cater for all of these different scenarios, not just the best case, not just the worst case. But as it stands, we actually don't know what the underlying distribution is of the range. So we don't know whether there's some sort of uniform distribution. We don't know whether there's some sort of central tendency. And what that means is that when the time comes to estimate the value of preventing these outbreaks, we actually don't have a good sense for what it is that we're actually preventing. And so usually at this point, particularly if you've come from a biosecurity background, I've picked on some things that are very near and dear to people and that they've sort of held as central tenets to people. And I get this kind of look on people's faces and they say, well, what then, smarty pants? What should we be doing if you're telling us that everything that we've been doing up until now is wrong? There's really 3 things about our approach that we've taken with this project that are different, that I think are worth emphasising for the audience today. The first is that we focus on assets. This is kind of the inverse of what people would normally do in a biosecurity context, where normally they would focus on the hazards and they would sum up the damage of those hazards. Where in fact, what we're doing this time is we're saying, well, the primary objective of biosecurity is to minimize harm on assets. Let's make those the center of analysis and then progressively damage those assets given the arrival of the hazards over time and across space. So we start with assets and then we do exactly what I've just described. We damage them in accordance with the hazards that are present in the landscape at a particular point in time. But also we reduce those number of hazards down to just 40. So to give you an impression, there are 16,500 biological organisms, pests, diseases and weeds that have established in at least one country other than where they're native. It's completely impractical for us to model the impact of all 16,500 of those species, but we don't have to, because of the fact, as I demonstrated in that previous slide, that the impacts of fruit flies can actually be captured by a much smaller subset of those species, because the management measures that would be taken, the risk controls that we put in place, and the impacts caused by those species are actually remarkably similar, and that they themselves have a distribution within a functional group. So what we do is we group those things, those organisms down into 40 separate hazards and model the hazards as functional groups rather than species and individual. The other thing that we do is that we don't just model a single year event and say, okay, well, let's, what's the annualized likelihood and what's the long run consequence, and compare those together, because the damages that are caused in the long run depend on the system actually continuing to operate for more than 1 year. Otherwise, we've got to take into account the fact that the system is on in year 1 and then turns off in year 2 in order to get an accurate estimate of consequences. So we've modeled it over a 50-year period, but we can vary that. It's just a different input to our analysis. At the beginning of that process, as I said, is assets. So we conducted a large benefit transfer study back in 2019, where we looked at 16 different assets according to the CEBRA classification. So CEBRA is the Common International Classification for Ecosystem Services, and essentially determined what the gross value of those assets were at a regional scale. And using the agriculture example on the left, essentially what we said was, what is the value of livestock within the Port Phillip and Western Port Natural Resource Management region? What is the value in the Corangamite Natural Resource Management region, and so on? And then looked, which are available from Australian Bureau of Statistics. And what we then did was said, okay, well, where do those production systems occur across space based on known land use attributes, and assign those based as a dollar per hectare, essentially, based on the total number of hectares of land use, and repeated that process for each of the different kinds of agricultural production systems, which results in a map similar to what we've got here, or exactly what we have here, actually. And then we repeated that same process for each of our 16 different assets. In this example here, we've got carbon sequestration. And again, we know what the native vegetation classes are across space. These are obviously forested areas. You can see down here, there's obviously also lower heathland areas and some wetlands that you can see here in darker green. And we know, based on studies overseas, but also in Australia, what the total amount of carbon is that those particular vegetation types are able to sequester per annum. We're then able to multiply that out by the value of that carbon sequestration and assign that to an asset over space in terms of an annual flow. There are then ways to convert that back to the total value of the asset by discounting that over time, the same as what we would think about the value of a house relative to its annual rental yield. And then what we're able to do is sum those up over time, as I said, and across the range of assets that we're interested in considering. So the total annual flow of those assets was in the order of about 250 billion per annum, and a total value over 50 years discounted was in the order of 3.5 trillion. Again, touching on some of those results that we had earlier, what's really interesting about the value of the assets that the biosecurity system protects, whilst we typically think of it as being an agricultural endeavour, portfolio industries, which are the industries that are administered within the agriculture portfolio. It's a bit of an unusual language, but it's the way that government thinks about the problem, are only about 25% or less than 25% of the overall value of the assets that are actually protected by the system. And in fact, when you look, environmental assets comprise somewhere in the order of about 60%, and then a much smaller amount for both domestic companion animals, so cats, dogs, horses, goat, alpacas, and infrastructure, which is also something that we don't commonly think of as being protected by biosecurity, despite the fact that we're trying to keep out organisms like termites and borers and other things that have obviously got significant infrastructure impacts. And then, as I described earlier, we're able to think about the hazards that we protect, and we can say, well, what do we think the arrival rates are of those respective organisms? How quickly will they spread across space and fill out their available host? And what will the damage be in terms of a marginal or a proportional reduction in yield upon each of those assets where they're present? So you can see here one of the examples that we've used is broken down our hosts into broadacre here. So this is cropping, wheat, canola, barley, those kinds of commodities. And we're interested in mollusks that affect broadacre crops, and golden apple snail was the exemplar that was used for that. It has a rate at which it spreads across space, a rate at which we expect it to arrive, so an annualized likelihood, the rate at which we expect it to spread across space, and then a series of marginal reductions in yield that have come from a really wide range of sources, including some work done by our team here at Melbourne. And then what we do is we treat those as a Poisson process. So we constrain and weight the arrival of those species across space based on population density, following a neighbourhood metric. So obviously a species can only arrive where there is susceptible host, and there may not be necessarily humans present in that particular host cell, but when we look at the broader neighbourhood, so if you think about a Moore neighbourhood where you've got an arrangement of pixels that exist around the particular cell of interest, we can determine the total population and also the land use in those cells to essentially risk weight the arrival of those locations. That's very important because what it does is it prevents the arrival of outbreaks in locations either where there is no susceptible host or are so far from anywhere that they're very unlikely to have outbreaks, again, to try and make sure that the distribution of events is reflective of reality. And then essentially what we do, and this is just a mock-up based on some very early work that we did, this is probably about 5 or 6 years old now, and really just illustrates the thinking. But what we're doing is we've got multiple different threats present, or multiple different hazards present in the landscape at one time that are able to do two things, most importantly. They are able to spread into themselves, and they are able to spread into each other. So not only do we have, and you can see there's an example down here, we have a couple of these red species that actually run into each other, but there are also other occasions, such as here we saw in that last simulation, where the red species runs into the green species. And so the impacts that those are having, we're actually able to capture those interactions rather than assuming that they're independent. And this is, at this stage, very simple models of diffusion following susceptible host, and then jump events based on frequency of jumps based on our elicited parameters. And then once we do that over a series of 50,000 repeated simulations, is that we're able to build up a likelihood of presence at a particular location over time. And we can see here, this is for a particular hazard, this is for broadacre virus. We can see that the probability of a broadacre virus event in the landscape in aggregate at time equals 20 is in the order of 8% down here for southern New South Wales, and that with the biosecurity system turned on, we're able to reduce that down to about 3 or 4%. If we then take that information, what we're able to do is convert that using those marginal reductions that we described earlier, and proportionally reduce the value of the yield that we're able to achieve from those assets, and multiply those out against the value of the asset in that pixel at that particular time step, and essentially sum them up. Which is what we're able to do here. And as I touched on before, by repeating this process several thousand times, we're able to ultimately converge on a stable distribution that indicates what the median damage, or the mode median or mean, in fact, damage would be in the event of the biosecurity system being turned off, and compare that with the expected damages in the likely scenario, or status quo scenario, where the biosecurity system remains on. When we first recorded these results and presented to the department, it would be fair to say allowing a group of university academics in to determine whether or not you're doing a good job is a fairly scary prospect for most government departments. And they were quietly pleased when we came back and said, well, we think the return on investment that you're getting is in the order of 30 to 1, which is in line with what the literature says that we should be getting from these kinds of interventions, but is still nonetheless a solid result. The conclusion then is, well, of course, we should do more. The challenge with that is that describes the average return on investment. And what I mean by that, and this is an example, so these numbers aren't the same as the 30-to-1 examples that I've described to you before. This relates to a containers example that we presented several years ago. But essentially what we're saying is, if you were to imagine, let's start down here, where the biosecurity system is turned off, and we were to calculate what the benefit would be, it would be 0 because there would be no biosecurity system. And then we compare that to the biosecurity system turned on, we have a series of costs and we have a series of benefits. So following this example here, we can see that the benefit is 75 million, the costs are 5 million here on the x-axis, 75 here over on the y, and we get an average return on investment of 15-to-1. That doesn't tell us what we would get if we were to spend more money on the biosecurity system. That's this marginal curve over here. And in fact, we don't know what that is, because we've simply just looked at what would happen if the system was turned off and what the system was turned on. And so in order to achieve the department's stated goal of trying to optimize their overall return on investment, what we need to know is we need to know what the shape of this curve looks like, so that we can start to both invest at the margin and ensure that resources are allocated according to their highest risk return, but also ensure that we have a solid understanding on what the benefits would be if we were to have additional investment in the project. And this was probably the #1 question that I got when we first tabled these results back to the department 12 or 18 months ago. And people kept saying, oh, well, you know, should we spend more? And I said, well, I actually can't tell you because we don't know. We've not undertaken that analysis. And the reason for that is that we've essentially treated the biosecurity system as this example B here, where we've got a range of hazards that we're trying to prevent. We have a single intervention, or we treat the system as a single intervention. And then, you know, a certain number of those get through and cause harm. But in fact, the biosecurity system resembles something like this over here at D. There are a whole raft of different interventions, some of which occur in sequence, some of which occur in parallel, that either jointly or separately target multiple different hazards. And for us to build that marginal benefit curve for the system as a whole, we actually need to know the individual marginal benefit curves for each of these individual interventions. We could do that looking at something like this, where here we've got, say, that same curve that we had previously, and we could just assume that that relates to one particular intervention, and that we can then compare that to a different intervention and say, if we wanted to invest at the margin, that our first intervention or our first investment of our first $1 million could go to the risk control that has the highest marginal return, the highest slope, which here is obviously 30-to-1, give the first $1 million to that, and then give the second $1 million jointly, or split it between control A and control B, given that they've both got 20-to-1 return on investments at that point. This is typically what would happen, and what is largely phrased as being investing at the margin. The problem with that in this particular context is exactly the same problem that we've described earlier on, and this is where the rubber hits the road for our current projects now, where when we think about those control structures, and this looks more complicated than what it actually is, but if we were to assume the simplest biosecurity system, we have one control here with 2 different settings, another control here with 2 different settings, and 2 different pathways, each of which manage 2 different hazards. So 2 pathways, each of which have 2 different controls and manage 2 different hazards. So very, very simply, we're already at the point where we have 4 different possible arrival rates for each of the different hazards that might arise. And in some cases, multiple hazards affect the same asset. And so what that means is that we've got the same challenges with dependence that we previously had in terms of being able to estimate the value of the biosecurity system in aggregate on those individual assets. And this means that tools and techniques like integer programming and linear programming that assume independence between each of those individual interventions, you know, each of those different items that we can place in our knapsack are not independent. There's a dependent structure. And when we start to then try and quantify what the objective function looks like for each of these, it quickly becomes a problem that is very, very hard. if we were to assume quite simply that there is in the order of 60 controls and that those only have about 5 investment levels, we've got in the order of 8 duodecillion unique investment strategies that we're able to deploy. And when I talk about this with, that's obviously sort of a slightly more meaningful number to this audience than what it is often when I'm talking about this project. But even if it was to take us a nanosecond to calculate the benefits to help us construct an objective function for each of those individual investment strategies, it would take us 27 to the 27 years to calculate the full range of benefits that are available to each of those different investment strategies. So this is a really challenging optimization problem, and is the one that is not, of course, new to any of you, that this is basically the curse of dimensionality. We've got a really wide range, a really large state space that we need to be able to explore, and we need to be able to find a path through that doesn't require us to essentially sample and calculate the benefits for each of the individual investment strategies that exist. That's really where the value-added project comes in, and there's basically 2 parts to this project that we're treating as a proof of concept. And the reason why we're treating it as a proof of concept is that it's not clear whether or not we'll be able to deliver a acceptable outcome here for the department in terms of something that they can put into production. So essentially, and this is quite typical of the nature of the projects that we deliver for the Commonwealth, we will have a go. If we can demonstrate that it's a viable project, that then potentially they'll continue to invest and we'll proceed with the project. And that's exactly what we did with Value in the first instance. We had a 1-year proof of concept phase that was then followed by sustained investment over another 2 or 3 years. The first part of that is actually to understand what the department wants in terms of a user requirements document for a tool that assists them make those resource allocation decisions. So what do they actually want to be able to do? Do they want to be able to compare the type and level of investment that they make in risk controls in order to adjust them up and down? Do they want to determine, so that's essentially a constrained sort of optimization exercise. You've got just 2 controls and they want to compare what the right investment level settings are between those 2 controls, given everything else that exists within the biosecurity system. So it's a sort of benefit maximization exercise. Alternatively, do they want to compare the type and level of controls along a particular pathway to determine what the minimum set of interventions is to ensure that they achieve that appropriate level of protection, which is, of course, a cost minimization exercise. And so these are the types of questions that we've been working through with the department. And we're then currently just starting the process now of working through a pathway model for the containers pathway. So there's 2.6 million containers come into Australia each year, and they follow through a series of different risk controls that have got a range of different possible levels in terms of what gets inspected, how frequently it gets inspected, and whether or not, in fact, it's inspected at all. And so we're developing a statistical model of that process in order to then be able to pair that with what we're terming our value model updates that says, okay, well, what is, given that particular container pathway model, what is the leakage that we expect to occur through that pathway, and joining that up with the value model at the end, with a view to thinking about how we can then optimize our investment across those 2 pathway models in the medium term to help them undertake their investment decisions. That's it for me for today. That's in terms of where we're at, but I'm happy to take any questions that anyone's got about what we've been working on, what we've done, or any suggestions about how we might go about our ridiculous optimization exercise.